Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the latest Tory chickens coming home to roost as faced with the imminent prospect of councils, including Tory councils, going bust. 44 Conservative MPs are reported to be preparing to defeat Rishi Sunak's votes in the Commons if he doesn't intervene. And when Sunak thought he'd seen off the last of the potential rebellions last week. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So yes, Sunak must have thought he'd put all talk of rebellion to bed last week. The far right bottled it and decided that replacing or blocking Sunak wouldn't make anything better for them. But this week there's a new and maybe more serious rebellion brewing. The first thing to deal with is this issue of why are councils in England suddenly going to the wall? If you were to follow right-wing shills on social media, you would think, oh, it's reckless Labour councillors because they only ever point to Labour councils folding, not the greater number of Conservative councils doing the same. At which point you start to think, well, why are Tory MPs rebelling against it then? In fact, actually, in at least one case, they'd highlighted a council which is Labour now, but has only just been taken over by Labour, so the deficit's actually built up under Conservative rule. Not that this is the fault of Conservative councillors either. I mean, yes, there are some incredibly stupid councillors, like those running Westminster City Council, who thought that spending £6 million on a big pile of dirt, which they called the Marble Arch Mound, would be a tourist attraction. As it turned out, people didn't fancy paying to walk up an artificial hill in London. So the same council then spent hundreds of thousands more getting rid of it. Ugh. These Labour councils. Oh, wait, no, that's a Conservative council. So, yes, you do get local councillors who do stupid bloody things. And I would argue, actually, most of them have been done by Conservative councillors. It's more likely anyway. After all, Labour councillors tend to be very focused on local public services. We know that there are some wrong ones as well. Like Lee Anderson was a Labour councillor, let us not forget, as embarrassing as it is. But generally speaking, Labour are focused on local public services. So Labour councillors have always got loads to do, whereas Conservatives don't believe in public services. So then you think to yourself, so what does a Conservative councillor do with their time? You know, so just like their Westminster brethren, they see the job of local government as doing as little as possible. So what do you do with your time? Well, the ones who are awarding public contracts in their own financial interest will often get bored and go, I know, let's spend millions of pounds on an hill. But the reason why, they probably didn't do it in a Yorkshire accent, but the reason why you don't see left-wing or Labour supporting commentators doing the reverse trick and only highlighting the Conservative councils going under and going, oh, Conservative waste, it's because we know what's really causing it. And what's more, we want people to know. We want it dealt with. We don't just want to find people to blame. The problem here is not idiots like the Marble Arch crew, it's savage cuts to council funding since 2010, which has coincided with greater demands as well. Because even if central government grants for local councils had kept pace with inflation, which they have not, it still wouldn't be enough to maintain services at 2010 levels, because as the population ages, greater demands for social care. These are largely the responsibility of the council. But it also has to be said you get greater social care demands if central government crushes the living standards and plunges more people into poverty. You know, we've seen in the last few years, the average height of, well, last few years since 2010 actually, the average height of 5-year-olds falling alarmingly in the UK since the Tories came to power. And in the US, when Trump came to power. It's funny that. Little wobble and back up for Germany. And in France, it's just increased. You know, this is a key marker of child malnutrition and therefore poverty, and is very much linked to government behaviour. This also creates extra demands on councils, and last year the phenomenon of rising demand for services but lower funding was reported as the Jaws of Doom, in reference to a graph highlighting the issue by Birmingham City Council, which people said looked like crocodile jaws. This is what is causing councils in England to suffer. There is more demand for services and less funding to deliver them. Over the past decade or so, local services have been cut to the bone. We've seen the wholesale closure of libraries, police stations and so on. It's not been enough. Councils have axed staff, placing greater demands on those who remain, just as in other areas like healthcare and education. Still not enough. The situation is now so bad that councils simply cannot balance the books. They cannot cut anymore. There are certain services they are legally obliged to provide, and there is not the money to do so. If the government really wants to blame Labour councils for the mess, no problem. What you can do is hold a public inquiry into the situation. I'd be comfortable with that. I think it's fair to say the conclusion will not be to blame councils of any kind, especially as most of those affected are Conservative councils anyway. And just to highlight the non-partisan nature of the issue, over 40 Tory MPs are reported to be threatening Sunak with rebellion if he doesn't do something about it. Now, like I said, why would 44 Tory MPs demand that Sunak boost funding for reckless Labour councils? They wouldn't. They'd make full use of it for the election year. So we can put that nonsense to bed. My worry is that in election year, with the Tories behaving with no reference to any moral boundaries whatsoever, is that they cough up some money for the affected Tory councils and let the Labour ones go to the wall. After all, it not only helps the Conservatives if it is only Labour councils going bust, but right now they're trying to maximise their attempts at tax cut bribes. Can't do that if they're having to come up with new money for public spending. So to deal with this potential rebellion, Sunak is going to need to spend as little as possible, preferably nothing. I suppose his first attempt will be to work out some scenario whereby he defers the problem for another year, just like he's doing with his budgets now. The Tory budgets of the last couple of years have been based on the idea of heavy borrowing now, and in order to balance the books, because you'd think to yourself, well, all of this borrowing that Jeremy Hunt's been doing as Chancellor is unfunded. And you think, well, what's the difference between that and Kwasi Kwarteng's unfunded tax cuts then? Because Jeremy Hunt has balanced the books by saying that in a couple of years' time, we're going to have savage public spending cuts after the election, of course. But the Conservatives are not going to be around to make those cuts, are they? And they're not saying where those cuts will come from, simply that they will happen. So he's made the books balance because he said, well, we're just going to cut public spending. The Tories right now, they're like Wimpy from Popeye. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. And the Guardian are pointing out that one of the Tory MPs threatening Sunak is none other than Robert Jenrick, who's already now a priced-in rebel. But more importantly in this situation was the minister in charge of council funding just a few years ago. So he is literally one of the Tories directly responsible for the mess English councils find themselves in now. Because this mess hasn't emerged in the last year. This has been going on for years. And it's been warned about since before Robert Jenrick was the minister in charge of council funding. Yet he is belly aching about it. Another case of Tories simply refusing to take responsibility for the consequence of their own behaviours. Not that Sunak deserves any sympathy for inheriting the situation. You know, not only has he allowed the situation to get to the point where, when warnings have been coming for years, he was one in a chain of Tory chancellors who drew up their budgets on the back of savage local council funding cuts. Sunak is as responsible as anyone for this. But finally, I do have to point out, I hate it when the mainstream media do this. There was a quote from the government at the end of the Guardian article. It said a few things I could take issue with, but in particular, it said that councils are ultimately responsible for their own finances. No, they aren't. They are ultimately responsible for the expenditure, how they allocate their funds. Even then, central government can lay guidelines, but by and large, they are responsible for how they allocate their funds. But finances is not just expenditure, it is income. And it is central government who determine council incomes. They set the government grants directly, and they also set the caps for council taxes. So councils are not free to set their own council taxes. There's guidelines for that set by central government. So this is completely untrue. And I absolutely hate it when media outlets print quotes like this to give the government the last word in an article, instead of going, well, this is what the government said, but let me just point out a few things, like critically evaluate the quotes. Mind you, this whole affair is quite interesting because, after all, council budgets have been gutted for years now. And there's been dire warnings for years. Before COVID, there were warnings that there's going to be a reckoning. So why are dozens of Tory MPs only now making an issue of it? They've gone from doing nothing, saying nothing, in Robert Jenrick's case, actually facilitating the problem, to all of a sudden, oh, we're going to rebel against the government. What flipped there? What changed? Oh, is it because it's election year and they fear for their seats? As a result, they're now threatening Sunak. And it makes you wonder, What further headaches could be coming Sunak's way if he doesn't turn the polls around as we get close to the election? You know, a couple of months down the line, he's lost. I mean, next month there's another couple of by-elections, loses those, and then more Tory MPs start to fear for their seats. What more rebellions may be coming his way? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.